Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Weather Extra. I'm meteorologist Jillian Grace. Hurricane season is in full swing, and in this week's episode, we're going to focus on all things tropical. First on Weather Extra, we're going to learn a little bit more about when hurricane season is and what an average season looks like for the United States. The Atlantic hurricane season begins on June 1st and continues through November 31st, but it's not impossible for tropical cyclones to form outside of those months. Today we are specifically talking about the Atlantic hurricane season, in which tropical cyclones form in the Atlantic Basin, which includes bodies of water like the Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico. Based on a 30-year climate period from 1991 to 2020, an average Atlantic hurricane season consists of 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes, which means storms that reach Category 3, 4, or 5 strength. According to the National Hurricane Center, the first named storm typically forms in mid to late June, the first hurricane in early to mid-August, and the first major hurricane in late August or early September. Tropical cyclones are one of the most violent storms on our planet and cause one of the biggest threats to life and property along coastal areas across the world. Tropical cyclones can bring a number of hazards such as storm surge, flooding, extreme winds, tornadoes, and lightning, all combining together to increase the potential for loss of life and material damage. Today on Weather Extra, we're going to take a deep dive on how these storms form. Here's an explainer from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, on how hurricanes form.
Hurricanes are very large and intense storms. But where do these giant storms come from? A hurricane starts with the warm water found near the equator. Hurricanes typically only form in tropical regions where the ocean is at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit. These warm waters evaporate, creating warm, moist air which acts as fuel for the storm. Wind is also needed for a hurricane to form. Many hurricanes in the United States are caused by winds blowing across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa. This wind causes even more of the warm water to evaporate into the air. The warm, moist air then rises high into the atmosphere, where it begins to cool. Way up there, the water vapor condenses back into liquid water droplets. Water droplets in the atmosphere form clouds, including big, stormy cumulonimbus clouds. As the warm air continues rising upward, the winds begin blowing in a circular pattern around a center. The spiraling winds gather up a cluster of big thunderstorm clouds. Once the spinning winds reach 74 miles per hour, the storm has officially become a hurricane. Hurricanes are huge. They can be 10 miles high and over 1,000 miles across. Once a hurricane hits land, it runs out of warm, moist air and its winds begin to weaken. But the storm can still cause lots of damage to communities near the coast. Thankfully, we have weather satellites that are constantly monitoring the conditions down here on Earth. The GOES-R series of weather satellites scan the hemisphere every 10 minutes and the U.S. every 5 minutes, keeping an eye on conditions that might cause a hurricane to form. Find out more about Earth's weather at NOAA's SciJinx.
You hear us meteorologists at KWTX and across the nation use certain categories on the different types of tropical cyclones based on their current strength. Hurricanes are measured by the Saffir-Simpson wind scale, which runs from a Category 1 up to a Category 5. The National Hurricane Center uses a scale to estimate the potential property damage a storm could cause, and today we're going to learn more about that. As you heard before in the show, tropical cyclones need certain things to happen to develop and strengthen, and they all follow the same rating criteria. A storm first becomes a tropical depression. A tropical depression is a storm with maximum sustained winds up to 38 miles per hour. As a storm strengthens, a tropical storm then forms. Winds within a tropical storm are between 39 to 73 miles per hour. These two tropical systems exhibit most of the same weather conditions: heavy rains to moderate winds, and even tornadoes at times too. There are two differences that separate a tropical depression from a tropical storm. The first is obviously their wind speed, and the second is that tropical depressions do not receive a name from the National Hurricane Center, but tropical storms do. When tracking a tropical depression, radar and satellite imagery shows the structure of the storm looking a bit unorganized, but starts to show signs of rotation. Tropical storms start to strengthen and get that symmetrical circular shape that we know hurricanes to have. As a tropical storm continues to strengthen, it then becomes a hurricane. In a Category 1 hurricane, winds range from 74 to 95 miles per hour. These very dangerous winds will produce some damage, like to frame homes and businesses. Power lines could be snapped, resulting in short-term power outages. Winds of 96 to 110 miles per hour can be found in a Category 2 hurricane. These extremely dangerous winds will cause extensive damage. Many trees will be uprooted, and homes and businesses can have major damage as well. Hurricanes that continue to strengthen then become major hurricanes, which means they have to be either a Category 3, 4, or 5. A Category 3 hurricane has continuous winds of 111 to 129 miles per hour, and devastating damage begins to unfold. There's a high risk of injury or death to people, livestock, and pets from flying and falling debris. Category 4 hurricanes cause catastrophic damage with winds of 130 to 156 miles per hour. Severe damage is left behind in these storms, including damage to well-constructed businesses and homes. And a Category 5 hurricane is the most devastating storm of them all, with winds at 157 miles per hour or higher. Everything living will be in danger as these storms move on land. The National Weather Service said most areas hit by a Cat 5 will be left uninhabitable for weeks or months, and sometimes it takes years for communities to come back to life after storms of this magnitude strike. There are many important tools meteorologists use to measure and track hurricanes and forecast where they are heading to. There's a special group of meteorologists that fly into those massive storms, and they're known as hurricane hunters. We had a chance to talk with one and learn more about what it is they do exactly. Take a listen.
We're gathering wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity, and pressure levels at the flight level as we're making continuous crossing pattern through the storm. And then we're also releasing instruments from the plane with what's called a drop sonde, which is we release it from the plane all the way down to the sea surface, and it's capturing that same data all the way down to the surface level. And so as we're flying through, we can get a really good picture of what the storm is doing, both at the flight level and the sea surface.
And you may be thinking, that has to be a crazy job, right? Well, this is what he has to say about some of his wild rides of flying through major hurricanes.
It's hard to describe with words. You really have to experience it. But again, it's kind of like a series of updrafts and downdrafts. So the plane will just kind of be flying along, and then you hit, kind of a zero G, where basically you're just flying straight up, and then you can slam back down again and back up and back down until you get through the worst of it. And so you can imagine what that feels like. Any roller coaster that you've been on where you've kind of experienced some of that pit of your stomach feeling, that times about 10.
Well, up next on Weather Extra is this week's Degrees of Science with KWTX meteorologist Brady Taylor and Sean Bellafiore, who will be joining us to talk about hurricane season. And we also have a look at the forecast for this year's Atlantic hurricane season 2. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Weather Extra. KWTX Chief Meteorologist Brady Taylor and meteorologist Sean Bellafiore sat down one-on-one to talk in depth about hurricane season. Here's a listen into part of their conversation in this week's Degrees of Science.
For folks that don't know, why is hurricane season from June starting up through the summer months?
Well, traditionally, during the hurricane season, we're talking about the amount of heat that we get in the oceans, and especially around the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific. The Northern Hemisphere summer, initially when we were starting out, the sea surface temperatures are coming out of winter, and this isn't like the air temperature where one day we'll get 100-degree high and then the next day it'll be 75. It takes some time for the water to build up. So when you start to get into late April and early May, that's when the sea surface temperatures start coming up. And then once you start to get into May, June, July, and especially August, September, October, that's when the sea surface temperatures are the hottest. And you also get these big storms that kind of come off of Africa, which they got all that water to go through. So, the hurricane season, it's I like to say it's time lagged a little bit to summer by about 2 months.
Yeah. What is your takeaways from last year's hurricane season?
Last year was a little bit of a stumper, I think, honestly. We had a triple dip La Nina, which, I mean, I'm only 30 years old, and 30 years, we've never really had 3 back-to-back-to-back La Nina years. La Nina is bad for, you know, humans in terms of hurricane season. It's great for hurricanes because the wind shear goes down, and typically you get some pretty warm sea surface temperatures too. So last year, everyone was anticipating that we were going to see another just like breakneck year. 2020, 2021, we had, you know, 24 storms plus each year. And last year, it looks like it was going to be the same thing, but we just never got the showers and thunderstorms in the right spot. But at the same time, we did eventually end up with about an average year of hurricanes. And it's just unfortunate. Every single year, you know, we could say that there's going to be 25, 30, 10, 5 hurricanes in a year. But if that one hits you, it's a bad day.
Yeah, because we had a bunch, but they were all out in the Atlantic or in areas that weren't affecting the U.S. And then, yeah, Hurricane Ian completely changed that view. So you were talking about La Nina. We're in the process of switching gradually to El Nino. What kind of changes does that make when it comes to hurricanes?
So when we talk about El Nino and La Nina, it's actually not a weather pattern. I personally don't like to call it a weather pattern. It's a sea-ocean pattern. What happens is you either get warm or cooler than normal waters off the western coast of South America, and depending on if it's warmer, it's a El Nino. If it's cooler, it's a La Nina, and that influences our weather. So when we're going into this El Nino pattern, it's kind of the opposite. You know, we expect a lot more hurricanes and tropical storms when we get to a La Nina, but when we're talking about an El Nino, it's usually reversed. Now, in the eastern Pacific, because of the warmer waters, the hurricane season is usually a lot more active than the Atlantic. But the Atlantic could still have these powerful storms, hurricanes, even during an El Nino year.
So we're kind of expecting kind of an average, if not slightly below normal kind of year. Is that what it looks like?
Yeah, at least all of the preseason forecasts that we have seen, be it from Colorado State or the forthcoming NOAA one, it's expected to be average. And I think part of the reason for that is because not necessarily we have El Nino where the wind shear is going to disrupt the activity. We have a lot of warmth across the Atlantic basin, the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Ocean, or the Caribbean Sea rather. Close to home, especially in May and June and August and July, of course, too. It's those storms that form in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico that have the best chance of impacting central Texas. Now, El Nino doesn't really bring a ton of wind shear to those areas, so the Gulf of Mexico and you know, the Caribbean Sea, where we have those warm sea surface temperatures, if we don't have the wind shear and something forms in there, it could very well be strong.
To hear Brady and Sean's a deep dive into all things tropical, scan the QR code on your screen to watch on YouTube or go to KWTX.com/degrees of science. And joining us now is meteorologist C.D. Finley, who brings us a look at what the National Hurricane Center is forecasting for this year's hurricane season.
Well, going into the month of June, we are now starting the 2023 hurricane season. Here's a look at the names that we have for this year. Our first storm will be Arlene, going on to Brett, Cindy, and then Don, Emily, going all the way down, ending with Whitney. So these are the storm names that we can expect to see going into the 2023 hurricane season. Now, as far as how many of these storms we will actually see, the NOAA preseason outlook expects somewhere between 12 and 17 named storms, 5 to 9 hurricanes, and 1 to 4 major hurricanes. And that's roughly about average what we've seen from 1991 to 2020. Usually about 14 named storms, and 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. And if we compare that to where we were last year in 2022, again, about average. And so we're really expecting something pretty similar to happen this year as time moves forward.
All right, on the other side of this break, we learn more about the dangers that tropical systems can bring to us in the United States, and also take a look back at last year's hurricane season. Stick with us. Welcome back to Weather Extra. The 2022 Atlantic hurricane season would go down in the books as an average yet extremely destructive hurricane season, certainly one not to be forgotten. There were 14 named storms last year, which hit the exact average, 8 of them strengthening into hurricanes, with 2 reaching major hurricane status. The season got off to a very quiet start with no named storms in August for the first time since 1997. The tropics began to ramp up in the month of September and remained active through October and into November. There were 3 storms in particular that made the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season an unforgettable one: Ian, Nicole, and Fiona. Ian was the 5th strongest hurricane to ever make landfall in the U.S. as a Category 4 storm. Ian had 150-mile-per-hour winds that brought in nearly 12 feet of storm surge and killed more than 150 people. Hurricane Ian left a huge swath of destruction across the southeast and ranks in the top 10 costliest hurricanes in U.S. history, causing more than $112 billion in damage. Now we turn to Chief Meteorologist Brady Taylor, who has more information on what dangers these storms bring and how they impact us and our property.
When tropical cyclones strike a community, it can leave behind an obvious path of destruction due to heavy rain, high winds, storm surge, and even tornadoes. Tonight, we're going to discuss each of these impacts that hurricanes bring and how it all happens. We'll start with flooding caused by heavy rain, something we've experienced plenty of times here in central Texas. Tropical cyclones can often produce widespread torrential rain. Flooding is the major threat for tropical cyclones for people living inland. Rainfall amounts are not directly related to the strength of the tropical cyclone, but rather the speed and the size of the storm. Slower moving, larger storms like Ian produce more rainfall. Parts of Florida saw as much as 20 inches of rain from Ian. Now, Hurricane Harvey, which hit the Houston area back in 2017, dropped up to 60 inches of rain and caused $125 billion in damage. Another threat that people are sometimes not aware of is the ability of a tropical cyclone to produce tornadoes. Tornadoes produced by tropical cyclones are usually relatively weak and short-lived, but they still pose a significant threat. Planes at a local airport, like you're seeing here in this video in Florida, were flipped over and destroyed as a tornado moved through. These tornadoes most often occur in thunderstorms embedded in rain bands well from the center of the hurricane. The majority of tornadoes associated with tropical systems occur in the right front quadrant of a tropical system. This area typically has the best wind shear and instability. The next impact is strong winds, which is one of the most destructive effects from a hurricane. Ian caused catastrophic damage across the southwestern Florida coastline, tearing off roofs from homes and ripping signs straight from the ground. Ian reached max winds of 155 miles per hour before moving on shore. But at the time of landfall, Ian was a strong Category 4 storm with winds of 150 miles per hour. The strongest winds in these storms are located in an area of the storm called the eye wall, right around the eye of a hurricane. And unlike thunderstorms that we see here in central Texas, where you get a quick burst of these severe winds, in hurricanes, these strong winds can last for hours and destroy everything in its path. Now, you may have heard that strong hurricane-force winds are the biggest threat when it's caused by these storms, but it's actually the storm surge. Storm surge causes an extensive property loss from erosion of beaches, damage to coastal habitats, just like we saw with Ian. And for more in-depth explanation of what exactly is storm surge and how it happens, we'll turn it over to meteorologist Sean Bellafiore.
Tropical storms and hurricanes bring a myriad of impacts to anywhere it moves ashore and, of course, farther inland. But one of the most deadly aspects of a tropical storm or hurricane is the water, and more specifically storm surge. This is a coastal issue mostly, so central Texans don't really have to worry too much about storm surge. But if you know anyone close to the coast, this is what it does. You have your normal sea level, your normal tides, whatever they may be, and then because of all of the wind with this landfalling tropical system, it takes the water, piles it up, and pushes it ashore. So this wind-driven storm surge, if we're talking a 3-foot, 6-foot, or 12-foot surge, that is the amount of water above your normal tide. And one of the most recent examples of a deadly storm surge came from 2022's Hurricane Ian, of course, making landfall in southwest Florida on September 28th with 150-mile-per-hour winds. Now remember, there's counterclockwise rotation to the winds around landfalling tropical systems or around tropical systems in the northern hemisphere, and it's that counterclockwise flow that pushed water from the Gulf of Mexico pretty much directly into some of these bays around Fort Myers and Port Charlotte. Notice that the wind-driven surge, there was nowhere for that water to go but inland, creating, of course, a lot of the devastation we saw with Ian. Reporting in the studio, Sean Bellafiore, KWTX News 10.
Coming up after the break, we talk more about how often tropical systems impact Central Texas and learn more about how you can stay prepared. Welcome back to Weather Extra. You may be sitting at home thinking about how often Central Texas sees tropical systems. For more on that and how you can stay prepared during hurricane season, here's meteorologist Camille Hawksworth.
That's right, Jillian. Central Texas, we can have impacts from hurricanes as well. This is actually a look at all the tracks that have made their way 50 miles within the Waco area since 1960. That's 12 different storms that have made an impact on Central Texas. Now, when they get to us, they're only depressions or storms. They do lose some of their strength as they move more inland, but we can still see strong winds and also very heavy rainfall as well. The most recent storm that's made its way through Central Texas was actually Tropical Storm Bill in 2015. So we definitely want to stay prepared when these storms start to make their way in the Gulf of Mexico, because again, we have impacts from that as well. So what you can do is get an emergency kit ready to go with some supplies like water and non-perishable foods for several days. Make sure you have a battery pack for your cell phone and other electronic devices. A flashlight, again, extra batteries, and a first aid kit are some of the things that you can also get those things prepared for before the storm moves onshore. So that's a list of the emergency items you can find on NOAA.gov hurricane-prep for a full list of supplies that you would need in case a hurricane moves onshore. And as we are in hurricane season, you'll definitely want to stay updated on the forecast. We have hurricane season all the way through November.
That's all we have for you on today's episode of Weather Extra. Just as you heard from Camille, as we continue to make our way through hurricane season, make sure you're staying up to date with the tropical forecast. We'll see you again next weekend for another half hour of weather and science.